I love that rendition, except that in terms of seeing that face, I would say it would be our face. So, but other than that, I love that. And I'll tell you, I think that growing up the way I did in the religion I grew up in, this was a song that we had that we would sing. And I really believe in looking back, I think it was sort of the beginning of my journey to find eventually metaphysics and to find the journey where I am on today. Because what I was aware of as a kid was I felt really good about myself when I tended to be alone. Sometimes there were people around me where I didn't feel so good about myself. And so the idea of this little light of mine, I just love that. I love that idea in terms of what it meant to me. What I found out was that basically there was something in me that I was okay with, that maybe others weren't okay with. There are two stories that come to us from, one of them from Western religion and the other one from Eastern traditions. And the first one is the story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. In some ways, if you look it up, it's referred to as the Garden of Sorrow. And it takes place, most of you know, it takes place when Jesus decides to get away from his disciples and to move into the garden and be in a place alone before the upcoming crucifixion. And so the idea that's put forth is this idea that he somehow knew what was going to happen. And so he wanted to get away from all those people that he was, all those voices around, and he wanted to get to somewhere alone. And he wanted to take on a task. But I would argue that what sets the tone for the task is in other places in the New Testament, and one of them is where he's talking about, somebody is talking about the value. What value do we have? Those people around him who saw him as the teacher he was. And that's how we see him. We don't see him as a savior. We see him as a teacher. And so they're basically saying, they're talking to him about, does my life matter? Do I have value as an individual? And this is a story where he points out the sparrows that are for sale in the marketplace. And he says, even these sparrows that really don't amount to any kind of monetary value at all, they are known, they are loved, they are cared for in this universe. And it was like, really? Yeah, and every hair on your head is known. You're loved, you're cared for. This universe is pulling for you. And so we kind of know in that moment we get a glimpse into him as a teacher and his ideas, and this idea that we each have this intrinsic value. This little light of mine, my light, has intrinsic value. There's another place in the New Testament where someone refers to, they want to know what's up with God, what's it like inside the interior of God. And he talks about, in my Father's house are many mansions. And his way of relating to God or to spirit was through the masculine, and so he referred to it as the masculine. But if we think of it as first cause or universal power or energy or God or whatever it is, basically he said there are many mansions there. And so if we think about that, what he's saying is that it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what your personality is like, there is a place for you. Once again, you have value, you have light, there is a place for you. And then one of the last ones that I want to bring up that I think sets the table in terms of where his mind was at was he was being confronted by some people who were naysayers, and they thought that he was dangerous, and they thought that his teachings were dangerous, and they wanted to ridicule him and put him down. And the thing about Jesus, if we look at the geography of the biblical narrative, is that in his lifetime he didn't travel very far. So he was a local boy, right? He was in Chico. He was in Chico his whole life, right? And he was being a prophet. And so this one day they say, hey, and this is within the context of the time, especially in the larger religious ideas of Judaism. And I'm not being critical of this, but this is just a reality. And basically it said, you're this big teacher, you're the Messiah and all that. We know you. We know you. We know that your mother Mary was what? She got pregnant with the Holy Spirit? What's up with that? Who's your father, Jesus? All this stuff you talk about, we know you. And he stands before them and he said, you don't know me. I am in this place, but I am not of this place. You think you know me, but I have a little light that you don't know about. And so we see this teaching that he brings forward throughout the New Testament. And yet, when there comes a time where he wants to transcend, he wants to move forward. So let's move the idea of crucifixion out of it for a moment. Let's think of it as transformation. Let's think of it as the next stage in the journey. Let's think of it in terms of enlightenment or whatever you want to call it. And he wants to go to this stage. And yet he goes into the garden to be alone. And the way, the Bible is a very melodramatic document. It's like watching the three Godfathers, right? It's just all this carnage and mayhem, and it's colorful and it has characters, and it's very melodramatic. It's like, think of it in that way. And it's all meant to be metaphor. It's all meant to try and grab our attention. So he goes into the garden, and it says that he faces the darkest aspects of himself. And those dark aspects come to him in voices. And at one point it's referred to as, almost like demonic and from the devil and Satan, and everything is in his face. He's in this darkness, and this entity, this voice, whatever it is telling him he is basically of no good. The back has been turned on you. Who do you think you are? If you will just give in to the darker forces, you don't have to mess with transformation. You don't have to mess with growth. You don't have to mess with evolution, because you're not worthy of it. And so when I read that, I think about, this is the way I would encourage us to think about this. Here's a gentleman, a person, with all these great teachings about oneness, little lights, authenticity, worth, power, love. The universe is conspiring for us. We have a relationship with Spirit. And yet, what do we find out about him? He has low self-esteem. He has self-worth issues. He has traumas in his background that are rising up. He doesn't feel love. He feels abandonment instead. The back has been turned on you, Jesus. Psychology would say that's abandonment. Almost like inner child work. So he goes into that place and he confronts it, and he prays and he screams, and he is frightened, and he does battle with this, and he moves through it. And when he moves through it, the story goes on, is that he is able to do what he wants to do. In fact, he does it and takes the high road with one of the greatest teachings of forgiveness that you can find in any piece of literature anywhere. What did he do? He found himself. Because all that other stuff that he was confronting in the garden was the fear-based ego that took him away from who he really is. That's how psycho-spirituality looks at this, which is something that we believe in this teaching. We're a teaching where we believe that our best way forward in life is to refine, to recover, and to move forward in our consciousness. It is our consciousness that creates the opportunities to grow, evolve, and change, to forgive, to be a light to other people. But so here's this world-class teacher whose name is still with us today, who basically went into the garden and had a nervous breakdown. And the nervous breakdown, like they always are, is an inside job. The story that comes from the East is we know about the Buddha and the Bodhi tree. And I read a version a couple of years ago, because what I always thought it was in different places I read was, we know that he had tried all kinds of different ideas to find enlightenment. He went to cults, he went to teachings of depravity, He was the begging monk with the bowl. He was, all these horrible tasks he had to go through to basically beat himself into enlightenment and beat himself into understanding, to be deprived, to be despised, to be kicked out into the forest, right? And he tried all these different ways, and he wasn't finding enlightenment. He wasn't finding anything. In fact, I would argue, if we use the modern lens of psychology, he was out there basically shaming himself. The guy had to be filled with all kinds of shame in terms of the way he was living. That was not a good way to live. That was tough. So finally he surrenders, and the story that I was aware of was that he came to this basically like an orchard, and there were different types of fig trees. And he chose one out of the three, and he sat down under it, and he decided, you know what, I give up. I'm just going to try and figure this out, and I'm going to meditate. And then it says after meditating for, many, many days, he arrives at a place of enlightenment. Okay. 2 years ago, I was reading a book, I believe it was called The Naked Buddha, and I saw a rendition in that book that made more sense to me. And so basically, I want you to think for a moment about a statue of the Buddha, a rendition of him. Now, we all have in our head the statue that maybe is in our garden, our dashboard, our altar, or whatever, where, slender, good-looking person, it looks very serene, got the little helmet hair going on, right? Little kind of half a smile, lowered vision, upright, very yogic, right? We have that version. Incredibly healthy looking. Almost androgynous, which is also important, right? But there's a statue, and I don't know if you've seen it. It's in one of the museums, I think, in Great Britain, where it's called the Emaciated Buddha. And basically, he's in the lotus position, and he's basically looks like a skeleton, but not quite. He's gaunt. You see every rib. You see every bone. You see every joint. And while he has the basic look on the face, he looks a little bit like he's not comfortable, right? And so I've heard different ideas about what that means exactly. And what makes sense to me and what I've heard is that this is sort of a representation of who he was as he was sitting down at the Bodhi tree. Like he'd been through it. He tried all this other stuff. And he had worn himself out. He had depleted himself. So now he sits there, and this is what I read in the rendition I want to share with you, is that at some point, demons and fire and brimstone came his way, and it washed over him, and it depleted him, and it stoned him, and it accosted him, and it abused him. And he sat there in the midst of it. And those voices were all reminding him of, who do you think you are? You used to be a prince. Now you're trying to be something else. You have been in all these other traditions the last few years. You haven't learned anything because, you are still haunted by us. And the way the rendition says, at one point, Siddhartha, which is what his name was able to split himself sort of in two and move away and stand back and watch this entire thing going on to him from the outside. That's called the shifted perspective in spirituality. He could actually watch what was going on. And the author of the book I read said, imagine for a moment that around this whole scene, and we've all seen this in the Buddhist symbolism, that piece that looks like a ship's wheel, and it has the spokes that go into the middle. And in the middle was the Bodhi tree with the Buddha. And Siddhartha finally realizes that he is different than the person at the Bodhi tree. He is Siddhartha, and the person in the Bodhi tree is the Buddha. And the author says, imagine the Buddha walking around that wheel looking for the correct spoke to go into the middle and to claim himself and say to the fire and the demons and the brimstone, you are not me. I am transcendent of what you are. Again, in modern psychology, we would say all the low self-esteem, all the abandonment, all the past traumas, all the childhood stuff, taking it on in that place. And over time, as the Buddha began to gain his strength and know the truth of himself, the Bodhi tree begins to look like the head of a cobra. And the cobra is facing down the fire, facing down the brimstone. What was the Buddha preparing for? His service, a teacher. He was preparing to go live what he knew about himself, the truth. This little light of mine, in both cases. Taoist scholar Ellen M. Chin asserts, knowing the everything, now that's her idea of what we would call spirit or God. Knowing the everything draws us close to the everlasting. While lack of this knowledge is the reason we try to employ inadequate strategies to our lives' challenging details. What did Jesus and what did the Buddha discover? The everything, the everlasting. Where did they discover it? Ultimately, within themselves. I worked for a Center for Spiritual Living in Paradise for a long time, and there was a woman, there was a couple there, Jeanette and Harold. I won't give you a last name. And Jeanette was heavily involved in the center, and Harold liked to show up on Sundays and have coffee and stuff, and he was a real social guy. He was a great guy. They had this really beautiful marriage. They had met each other in middle age after they both had first marriages and kids and stuff like that. And both of them went through divorces, and they found each other in life. And they came together, and they had a love affair, and they were able to finish raising those kids, his kids, her kids, kind of like the Brady Bunch, but real. And so they did that. And over the years, if anything, from what I understood, they became closer and closer and closer, just a real love affair. They would take vacations down in Baja. They would fish on the ocean down there and hang out in the beaches down there with the seafood and stuff, all this great stuff. He worked in the aerospace business. She worked somewhere. They put together really good retirements. And they ended up coming to Paradise and to retire. And that's where I met them at the center. And so I got to know Jeanette. She was really a wonderful person. It's interesting. She was into Catholic mysticism. Okay, she was Hispanic and she was raised Catholic, but she didn't like the whole priest and all that stuff get down. She was just she was into the mysticism of it, and she talked about her relationship with Jesus, who was her older brother and her teacher, and I always loved that. So they went along, and she was involved in stuff, and then Harold had a couple of health challenges that were very severe. And basically, he ended up incapacitated to a large extent. And I was concerned about Jeanette in terms of moving into the caregiver mode, So one day, whenever I would see her, she had this beautiful smile, and she was upbeat, and she just was who she was. And I would ask about Harold because we didn't see him for a while. Oh, yeah, he's doing good and stuff. And so anyway, this one day she said, Andy, can I come see you in your office this week? And I said, yeah, that'd be great. So she came in, and and I said, what can I do for you? And I thought it was going to be about the situation with her husband. And so she starts talking about, she said that she goes, I love my daughter, but the way she's treating her son, my grandson, drives me crazy. He's a young adult. He's trying to form a career. She wants to get him into the family business, and she won't see him for who he really is. I don't know how to show up. And so I listened to all this. So we talked, and I just kind of kept looking at her, and finally she goes, Andy, what's going on? I said, Jeanette, I'm really concerned about what you're going through with Harold. I want to make sure you're okay. And she goes, well, why would you ask me that? I said, well, sometimes I said, when people go into caregiving, they can kind of lose themselves. And she goes, why? I said, well, it happens sometime. And she said, Andy, she goes, I want to tell you something. There was a time in my life where I did lose myself. It was my first marriage. And once I took care of that, I have done everything in my life to remember who I am. And I can love my husband and I can care for him and I never lose sight of who I am. And she said, I want to tell you something about us that reflects how I feel. She said, all these years we've been married, if you were to come to our house on Sunday afternoons, you would have seen us sitting on each sitting on the end of the couch with a Sunday newspaper. Remember those? Thick. All the sections, all the comics, all the writers, all the books, all just these huge papers. We loved to get the Sunday paper. We would each sit on the end of the couch and we would tear it apart and share it with each other. And there's parts I read and parts he didn't read, and we, and shared. And she said, the paper would be all over the house, and we'd be sitting there with a cup of coffee, and I'm in my sweatpants, and he's in whatever, and we're just hanging out. And he said, that is our relationship. I decided in my first marriage I was never going to be what somebody else wanted me to be. I was going to be me. I said, if you could walk into our house on a Sunday, you would see what being me is all about. I said, okay, I'm good. I thought that was so amazing. So Harold ended up having some deeper challenges and ended up over here at the Inlow Physical Therapy here in Chico as a patient. He was actually in there as a patient, and to help him become more mobile. They really had to work with him vocationally and with physical therapy. And so I didn't see much of Jeanette. I was a little bit concerned about her. I asked some people how she was doing, and with Harold in there, no one's really talking to her, seeing her. I go, oh God, I hope she's okay. So this one Sunday, she wasn't there again. So when the service was over, I came down here to Chico, and I wanted to go into the physical therapy and see Harold. So I walk in there, and I don't know how many of you know that place. It's a huge waiting room out there, full of all kinds of chairs and stuff, all these sofa kind of things. So I walk up to the desk, and I said, yeah, I'm here to see Harold so-and-so, and I don't know if he's in therapy or whatever, but I'd like to see him. And there was a therapist there who goes, he's not in there right now. I said, where is he? He's out here. I said, what are you talking about? He's back there in the corner. So I look over there, and there's Harold in a wheelchair, and there's this seat there that would be for about 3 people. It's kind of like a little couch. And there's Jeanette on there, and they got the paper all torn apart all over the place. And they're just sitting there reading the paper together, a Sunday. So I walked over there, and I wanted to be my minister self. Okay, how are you guys? Oh, how are you guys doing? And so Jeanette, she's got the paper like, we're doing good, Andy. How are you doing? I'm doing pretty good. Okay, that's good. It was amazing to me. She was just who she was, A writer who I really like a lot, his name is John Lee, he said, I do know what I want, to simply be myself. That has worth beyond measure, because claiming myself gives me strength to love others fearlessly from the center of my soul. There it is. John Lee puts it all together. Jesus, Buddha, and Jeanette. They are so clear about who they are in the core of their soul, they can love others from that place. Oh my God. I'm going to end with this quote, and I want you to think about this metaphorically completely. A gentleman by the name of Cao Heng, he's an Eastern philosophy person. So think of this metaphorically. He said, the child is not really in a position to possess a supreme soul until it is capable of giggling. I love that. All right. Thank you very much, you guys. Okay. So,